went on to become a medical missionary in Nepal.
It is amazing. It is amazing.
They've all been through World War One. It's a whole generation. Absolutely amazing.
Aye.
Absolutely amazing. There's nothing like them.
Anyway, I hope I don't misrepresent them.
I will heckle if you do, don't you worry.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me call you to order and welcome you to Lennox Evangelical Church. This, I think, is the first significant event we've done in almost 2 years since the pandemic hit and lockdown came in March of 2020. So it's a real pleasure to see you here today. One or two very brief comments by way of introduction. So I know there's 4 things and they all begin with F and I meant to mention them all. So phones, please remember phone etiquette, maybe switch your phone to silent. That would be helpful. Food, most of you have already found the food, that's fine. The facilities are at the back, up there, and the fire exits are all over the place. You can almost not go in any direction, not find a fire exit in this building, not that we're anticipating any particular problems there. It's really lovely to see you. This is an event which is a kind of cut-down version of the events which Solas do. Solas, the Centre for Public Christianity, that I'm sure you've heard about, maybe visited the website. You'll hear more about it shortly from Andy. But they do Confident Christianity conferences, and the idea is to try and equip Christians to be able to feel confident and bold about articulating their faith in the workplace, with their neighbours, whoever, dealing with skeptics, dealing with people who might be hostile in some ways. And so I hope you'll pick up some tips and tactics today that you'll find useful in communicating your faith. Just before I introduce Andy to you, I'm going to suggest that we just pause and have a word of prayer and commit this afternoon to the Lord in order that we get the most benefit from our time together. So let's just pause and pray together. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for this opportunity to come. We thank you for renewed fellowship. We thank you for new friends and contacts that we can make. We thank you for the many blessings that you have given us to enjoy even already this afternoon. We thank you for this day, this place, this church, for the people who are here to help, for Andy and the ministry that he's involved with. And we pray, Lord, today for ourselves, that you would help us to feel as if we can get off the back foot as Christians and really engage the kind of issues that we know are important to advance the gospel, the good news, the rescue plan of the Lord Jesus in a community that so desperately needs to hear it. And so we ask for your blessing on our time together, that it would be time that's constructive, that's time that's also honouring to you. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. I was just pondering, how on earth do you introduce somebody like Andy Bannister? He's a little bit unique in many ways, because I was just trying to think of the various strings he's got to his bow, you know, the various angles that you could possibly follow. He's the director of Solas, he's husband to Astrid, he's got 2 children, he lives in Dundee. All of that's fair enough, and actually probably quite important. But he's also a bit of a philosopher, a bit of an author, a very gifted speaker. He's into puns, as you're almost certainly going to find out this afternoon. He's written a number of books that he'll tell you about there this afternoon. He is also a bit of a mountaineer, very keen on mountaineering. And on top of all of that, and this is the bit that just seems not to sit in any kind of balance with any of the rest of it, he's got a PhD in Islamic studies. Figure that one out. Maybe he'll tell you about it a little bit later. But this afternoon we've got 4 shortish talks, and I'm going to invite Andy to come now. He can say a little bit more by way of introduction, but his first talk, I think, is how to share your faith without seeming like an idiot. Andy, thank you. Please welcome him, folks.
David, and thank you for that warm welcome. Great to see so many of you in such a friendly audience this afternoon. I spend half my time teaching Christians how to share their faith with their friends and neighbours and colleagues, but also half my time addressing really hostile audiences I mean, you look like a friendly audience this afternoon, but sometimes I have to speak to Baptists, and I tell you, they are just vicious. But no, very seriously, I love to be with you kind of this afternoon. As David said, we're going to pack a lot into the next 3 or so hours. I'm going to do 3 talks for you. We're going to think about how we can share our faith in Christ without looking like an idiot. Then David's going to come and talk about faith and science and all those kind of big questions that he's so good at. I'm then going to talk about how we address the question of where is God in a world of suffering. Then we're going to look at the resurrection. And then we've got Q&A at the end of the afternoon. So if there's any questions you have, you can put those to David and I. David, by the way, he's too modest to say this, but he loves the most difficult questions you can think of. So if you've got a real doozy of a question, save that. David would love to have that. The harder, even in a foreign language, I mean, he'll do it. He'll do it all. One quick housekeeping announcement before we dive into the first talk. There's various bits of paper on your seat this afternoon. We'll come to some of them later, but the main one I want to draw your attention to right now is this little white one here, where you can give us your email address. If you give us your email address, we'll do a couple of things at Solas. The first thing we'll do, we'll take your email and we'll sell it to Google and make a fortune. Actually, no, probably got it already, actually. No, we won't do that. Promise you we won't do that. What we will do is we will send you the slides from this afternoon. So I'm going to be using slides quite extensively. David is known for slides with wonderful pictures all over them. We will send those to you. We used to do this by passing a clipboard around, but in these COVID times, we don't do that. Just jot your email address down and either leave that then on your seat or bring it to the bookstall at some point, give it to us, and then next week we'll get you the slides from today. And that means, again, you can just revisit what you've done, and if there's any sort of quotes and bits and pieces on there you really like, you'll have it to hand. So anyway, let's talk for a short while about how we can share our faith in Jesus without looking like an idiot. Well, my first job was working for the psychiatry department of a large teaching hospital in South London. This is not a Dundee accent. You will have picked this up. I was born in London, in fact in South London, as we call it down there. And I worked for St George's Medical School, helping them run medical conferences. And I loved my years working there for the university, for the medical school. Lots of fun, learnt lots of stuff. But I also look back on that time there with slight guilt, because during my time at St George's Medical School, I was a little bit, I have to confess, of an undercover Christian. In fact, I've long thought that Undercover Christian would make a great movie title. Actually, in fact, I have to say, when the TV series Silent Witness came out, I first thought that was about Christians in the workplace or at university, sneaking around, trying not to be outed. But I played this game of Undercover Christian. You know, outside of work, I was involved in lots of stuff at church. I was involved in youth work and all kinds of things in my congregation. But inside work, inside my place of work, I took my little light of faith and I hid it under a bowl, and I put the bowl in a box, and I surrounded the box by blackout curtains. So terrified was I of being discovered as a Christian. In fact, the ironic thing is I discovered that a woman who worked 3 doors down from me was playing the same thing, because at my leaving party after 6 years working there, I discovered she was a Christian. And we'd both played Undercover Christian for 5 years and not even discovered there was more than one believer in the department. Now, if I look back on my time at St George's, 25 years or so ago, and I asked myself, what was it I was afraid of? What was it that I was afraid of? Why, if you'd asked the 25-year-old me, why I didn't share my faith at work more actively and more confidently, I think I'd have probably said things like, well, I'm afraid of looking stupid if I stand up and talk about Jesus. I'm afraid of looking like an idiot. I think I might have said, well, I'm afraid of standing out from the crowd, right? I want to blend in with everybody else, and if I talk about my faith, I'll look a wee bit different. I think I'd have probably said, well, I'm afraid of being asked a question I can't answer. What if somebody asks me about how can you be a Christian in a world of science, and I haven't discovered the 3,000 books that David Galloway has written? How would I have answered that question, and so on. And over the years, though, I've come to appreciate I'm not alone in playing Undercover Christian. I think a lot of Christians are afraid of sharing our faith in our workplaces, at school, at university, perhaps among our family or friends, if we hang out with non-Christians. Maybe many of you here actually sit there thinking, I'd love to be more bold in talking about Jesus, but realistically, perhaps I feel a bit foolish. I feel a bit inadequate. I don't know what to say. So how can we overcome some of those fears? Or, as a friend once put it to me bluntly, and from whom I borrowed the title for this talk, a friend once said to me, look, Andy, I just want to know how to talk about my faith without getting fired, quite frankly. And there's Alan Sugar looking all grumpy for you this afternoon. How do we do it? How can we share our faith at work, at school, at university, among our friends and our neighbours without ending up in a total mess? Well, my family and I have lived in Dundee. Dundee is, in fact, the centre of the universe. You may not have discovered this, but it is actually the centre. That's what they tell me there. For the last 5.5 years. But before we moved to the centre of the universe, we lived in Toronto, in Canada, for about 5 or 6 years. And shortly after I moved to Toronto in Canada, I became friends there with a GP, a guy called Peter. And I remember early on in one of my conversations with him, he was a committed Christian, was a GP, and I remember a very early conversation where Peter said to me, he said, I love being a GP. I love being a GP. It gives me so many opportunities for sharing my faith with my patients and doing evangelism. And he went on to tell me that he had led dozens of patients to faith in Christ over the years. Now, at hearing this, my ears pricked up, because I don't know whether we have any kind of medics in the room, or maybe you know a few. It can be tough being a Christian medic. I know many Christians in the medical profession are terrified about being accused of even offering to pray with a patient, let alone leading them to Christ. How was he doing it? Most public service professionals I meet who are Christians, or most Christians in the workplace these days, I think find it really, really hard. So I was instantly intrigued. I said, so what are you doing? And he said, well, here's my method. He said, whenever I meet a patient who is struggling with something in their life, I'll take them through a little kind of life audit. I'll say to them, tell me about your exercise regime. How are you exercising? Tell me about diet. Are you eating well? Tell me about sleep. Are you sleeping properly? And he said, I'll throw out 5 or 6 of these questions. And the last one he will always ask patients is, okay, so now tell me about spirituality. Are you making space for that in your life? And he said, invariably what happens is the patient will then say, spirituality, what do you mean, doctor? And then Peter will say, well, some people meditate, some do yoga. I'm a Christian, so I read the Bible and go to church. That kind of thing. And then he said with a grin, I'm a doctor, I'm good at numbers. So I've tracked the numbers. He said about 93% of patients then say to me words to the effect of, you go to church, doctor? Well, now they're asking him the questions. And it is much easier. He's much freer to answer the questions his patients are asking him, because they're taking the initiative. Now, he said, I do have to keep in the drawer a couple of leaflets on yoga and Zen Buddhism, just in case anybody asks, and then I can say, well, that's not really my thing. Here, have a dusty leaflet. But over those 25 years now he's been doing this, he's had many conversations. He's seen huge breakthroughs in the lives of patients, and he's had the privilege of even praying with some of his patients to become Christians. And of course, what he's doing, the key to Peter's approach, is he discovered the power of questions. He'd simply discovered the power of questions in evangelism. Questions are one of the most powerful evangelistic tools I know, yet they're also one of the most overlooked tools in evangelism I know. But the idea of using questions in our evangelism, questions to try and have spiritual conversations, is not some sort of, wonderful new 21st century idea. It goes right back to Jesus, who's arguably the master question asker. In fact, somebody has counted, and Jesus asks something like 300 different questions in the Gospels. Next time you're reading, Mark's Gospel or something one evening, read it through in an evening and make a note in the margin of your Bible every time that Jesus asks a question or replies to a question with a question. You'll find he does it all the time. Let me give an example of what Jesus does, and then I'll show you how we can learn from the Master himself. So I'll give you a little example of this. In Mark chapter 10, we have this famous story, the so-called story of the rich young ruler. And Mark tells us that as Jesus started on his way, a man ran up to him and fell on his knees before him. Good teacher, he said, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Why do you call me good? Jesus asked. No one is good except God alone. Now, I wonder how often you've read that story or heard that story and thought, hang on a minute, what is Jesus doing? Because that is a pretty strange response, if you think about it. In fact, the sign it's a strange response is, imagine, perhaps this evening, after you're back home this evening, after this afternoon conference, you're sitting there on the sofa, drinking hot chocolate, watching TV or something, and there's a knock at the door. And you go and open it, and it's the next door neighbor. And your next door neighbor looks at you and says, "Good Christian, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Which of you in this room is going to give this answer? Right? You're going to say something like, I don't know, I come in and the kettle's on and I'll answer your questions. If you're feeling a bit more of a coward, maybe you'll give them a leaflet or invite them to the Christianity Explorer Alpha course or something. Or if you're a real coward, you'll say, come to church on Sunday and the pastor will tell you. And then you'll get on the phone, right, and ring the pastor up and say, preach your best sermon tomorrow, mate. We've got a live one coming. But you're not going to do this. So why does Jesus do this? Why doesn't Jesus say, I'm the Son of God, follow me, or come to the Alpha course that Peter, James, and John are leading at the Sea of Galilee next Wednesday, loaves and fishes for everybody? Well, think about this for a moment. If you grabbed your average non-Christian friend, maybe it's a colleague or a neighbor, or if you go to a really liberal church, it's the vicar. Never do that joke ever again. You grab your average non-Christian friend and you say to them, look, I know you don't believe in God, but just grant me God for a minute. So imagine there's a God. I also know you don't believe in heaven, but again, don't argue. Just imagine for a moment there's a heaven. So there's a God, there's a heaven. Tell me, what do you think you would need to do to get there if there was a God and there was a heaven? What's the most common answer that people give to that question? Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. Great bit of interaction. Yeah, absolutely. Be good. Most people think if there's a God and if there's an afterlife, then just live a good life. Be a good, decent person, and God is an equal opportunity employer and will kind of pat you on the head and let you in. And this is what this rich young guy is saying to Jesus. He's running exactly this script. He's basically saying to Jesus, you look like a good person, so you're clearly going to heaven, mate, so how do I get there? That's in a nutshell what that guy is asking Jesus. So Jesus has to untangle all of that theological mess. And he could have done it with a sermon, or a parable, or a pithy little saying. Jesus could do all of those things. But he doesn't. He untangles it all with a simple question. Why do you call me good? Only God is good. If you think that through, he's basically saying to the young man, you're absolutely right. All good people do go to heaven, but the problem is only God is good. So you can follow the logic. All good people go to heaven. Only God is good. Who gets to go to heaven? Only God. And I'm afraid, by the way, your application to join the Trinity has been turned down this morning. Of course, it opens up another question too, doesn't it? If only God is good, but the young man has recognized that Jesus is good, it also just opens up that bigger question. Who exactly is Jesus in all of this? And Jesus does this with one simple question. See, questions can be incredibly powerful. And what I'd like to do in my remaining kind of 12 minutes is just teach you 3 simple questions that you can use, a bit like a kind of evangelistic Swiss Army knife, and kind of keep in your back pocket. Really helpful little tool that you can use to give you confidence in conversations with your friends, knowing you don't have to have the answer to every question, but you have some tools, some questions that you can ask that will get a conversation going. And the 3 questions I want to teach you are these. Number 1, what do you mean by that? Number 2, why do you think that? And number 3, have you ever wondered? Let me show you how they work with perhaps some sort of little worked examples, as it were. So question 1, what do you mean by that? Let me use a scenario from the workplace. If you spend most of your life when you're not in church in work, this is great. If you're retired, perhaps think back to when you were at work. If you're a student, think about one day when maybe there will be a job for you if the economy continues in the right direction. But don't never do that joke again either. So you're at work. You're at your desk, working away on some project. It's all going well. It's Monday morning. When a colleague walks past. And the colleague notices the big black Bible you've got on your desk, because every Christian in the workplace always has the biggest, blackest, leather-bound Bible possible on the corner of their desk, right? So everyone knows that we're Christians. And your colleague sees the Bible and says, oh, you're not into that God nonsense, are you? Only idiots believe in God. Science has disproven God entirely. There is no evidence at all that God exists, period. And they say this loud enough that other people in your open plan office have heard. You can see other colleagues kind of looking around their workstations with a kind of this will be interesting look on their faces. Even one or two of your colleagues are getting popcorn out from under their desks. It's Christians versus Lions round 2. What do you respond? Well, of course, you could hide under your desk. You could, you could throw something at the fire alarm and just, evacuate the building. You could pray for the second coming. Or what about if you use the what do you mean by that question? What about if you said to your colleague, what do you mean when you say only idiots believe in God? I mean, some of the world's smartest men and women and, thinkers and scientists and whatnot believe in God. You might say, you said that science has disproved God. Well, actually, lots of scientists believe in God. Help me understand what you mean. You might say, you said there's no evidence that God exists. What do you mean by that? What would count as evidence for you? You might even say, look, you use the word God a couple of times. What do you mean by that word? Of course, your friend might say, well, I don't believe in some great big fairy in the sky who throws lightning bolts at people. Which is great, because you can say, well, I don't believe in that kind of God either. Hey, we're agreed. Isn't this great? And then that might just give you a moment to say a bit about the God you do believe in. And any of those approaches might turn this into more of a conversation rather than some terribly heated argument that gets precisely nowhere. And you can do that just using that what do you mean by that question. The second question works in a similar kind of way. Why do you think that? So let's illustrate again with a workplace example, or those who work in other settings too. So a similar scenario, you're working away at your desk, minding your own business, colleague walks past, sees the big black Bible on the corner of the desk, and you've got one of these really big Victorian ones with the wooden eagle reading stand as well, so they really do know that you're a Christian. And this time your colleague's sort of, rather loud put down is, oh, nobody believes the Bible, It's a book of ancient superstitions and fairy tales riddled with contradictions. Why on earth would anybody want to read that? Oh, and by the way, to make it fun, this time it's not just any colleague, it's a senior manager. So if you get a little bit too clever, you pass evangelism, 101, but you fail your annual review. So you should be a bit careful what you say. Well, this is where the why do you think that question can ride to the rescue. What about rather than, again, trigger the fire alarm or run away, resign and move to the Bahamas? What about if you said, well, thank you for what you just shared there. I just wonder if I might ask a question. What evidence particularly have you seen that's led you to that conclusion? You see what you've done. Your colleague has dropped a steaming load of skepticism on your desk, but they haven't given you any reasons. They've just given you opinions. So all you've done is ask them for their reasons, and there's a very good chance there probably won't actually be any. You can also say to them stuff, for example, like you could say, you said there were contradictions in the Bible. I've heard other people say similar things before, but I myself have never seen any. Could you tell me what's led you to that conclusion? In fact, could you show me one? What contradiction in particular was it you were struggling with? Now, when you push back like that and ask your colleague to justify what they've said, one of two things will happen. Either they will say, well, everybody knows, which is shorthand for I read it on Twitter this morning. And you can gently call that out if you want to. Say, maybe I think it needs better. That's not really enough, is it? Or they might give you an example. You might say, tell me a contradiction, and they might raise an issue. And then you can do one of two things. If you know the answer, feel free to share it. So go, you know what, that's quite a common question, but there's a really good answer. If you don't know the answer, that's no problem either, because you can say, well, thank you for that. I want to be thought through in my faith. I'll look into that. And then go and find the answer. Talk to an older, wiser Christian. Read a book, talk to your pastor, the internet, loads of great websites out there that will help you with that stuff. Find the answer, because that then gives you the opportunity a few days later to go and find that colleague and say, well, hey, thank you for that question that you raised in the office on Monday morning. I really got me thinking, and I really wanted to get an answer, because these things are important, and I found the answer. Are you interested in hearing it? Now they might just laugh you off, or they might say, well, go on then, what have you got? And now again, there's a conversation happening. So all of that can come from that, why do you think that question? So 2 questions down. What do you mean by that? And why do you think that? Last question I want to share with you in this opening session. And it concerns the whole issue of what do we do if our colleagues are not throwing anti-Christian remarks around the office? If your colleagues are skeptics and agnostics and atheists and whatnot, and they come out with this kind of stuff, fine. But lots of us probably have friends, neighbors, colleagues, classmates who are just apathetic, who are just simply not interested. the kind of person who's starting spiritual conversations can feel a bit like nailing Scotch mist to the wall. How do we engage those kind of people? Well, this is where the last question, the have you ever wondered question, rides to the rescue. Because although we have, our friends live in this, we live in this increasingly secular age where people would say they don't believe in God or spiritual type stuff, nevertheless, our culture is haunted almost by the sort of ghosts of faith, things that actually people care deeply about, but they care deeply about them because they're drawing on Christian roots, even though they haven't fully realized this. Let me show you what I mean is easier here. Think about things like joy, hope, beauty, meaning, truth, love, free will, ethics, justice, consciousness, and so on. I mean, the whole idea of human rights is interesting, right? If we are nothing more than atoms in motion, if we're nothing more than a primate that got lucky in the evolutionary lottery, what does it mean to talk about human beings having inherent dignity and value, and so on? So that and all these other areas are really interesting places for starting conversations where you can say to your friends, have you ever wondered why we care deeply about these things? As David said in his intro, I love climbing mountains. And I often have those kind of conversations in the outdoors with people. You're standing next to someone admiring this beautiful view from the top of Schiehallion or whatever, and you sort of say to them, hey, it's an interesting, amazing view, isn't it? Have you ever wondered why as human beings we're drawn to kind of natural beauty and art and this kind of stuff? Boy, there's a question that gets people thinking. And it's a question that, as you follow that thread, can lead in the God direction. And in fact, I got a friend of mine who teaches at University of Toronto, who teaches human physiology. And for 20 years or so, Chris has made this have you ever wondered approach the central piece of his evangelism among students. Whenever he's giving lectures on medicine and physiology and so forth, he'll find times regularly to throw into the conversation sort of big philosophical questions. Have you ever wondered what the implications of this are for human value and dignity or whatever it is? He'll throw some great big sort of question into the middle of his lecture, and then he'll look at the students that he's lecturing and say, well, you know what? We haven't got time to address that today. That's really more of a theological question. But you know what? My door is always open. And by sort of lobbing these into his lectures regularly over 20 years, Chris regularly finds students after he's lectured will come and find him in his office and say, hey, Professor, you raised a really interesting question in yesterday's lecture. And Chris will say, well, come on in. The kettle's on. Let's have a cup of tea and talk about that. And using that sort of seeding questions into lectures approach, Chris, like my friend Peter the doctor, has seen dozens of students come to the Lord over the years. And he does it by asking these have you ever wondered question. And in short, the have you ever wondered question, the third of our three questions, simply takes things that your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, your family members care deeply about, things like justice and beauty and truth and identity and all these things. And we simply ask, have you ever wondered why these things matter to us? Have you ever wondered what the source of these things are? And it's a very gentle way of provoking conversations about the deepest questions of life, questions that really only have an answer if God exists. So 3 questions for you to help you have conversations about faith without looking like an idiot. What do you mean by that? Why do you think that? And have you ever wondered? And I firmly believe that by asking good questions, we can open up good conversations with our friends and our neighbors and our colleagues and create the space at work, at university, at school, among our friendship groups for sharing answers. Because only the gospel offers answers to the deepest questions our friends are asking. And so my prayer for each one of you is that you would, by the power of the Spirit, have the boldness to ask good questions, to start great conversations, and learn through those to share Jesus naturally with the people he brings across your path. Thanks for listening, and David is going to come up straight away and head on into our second talk this afternoon, looking at some of the big questions of faith and science and all this kind of stuff. So thanks for listening, and David is, once he's changed the laptop from mine to his, is going to come on up.
Andy, off to a great start. I was just thinking, as Andy was talking about that third question, it actually resonates very closely with some of the material that I would like to suggest to you, because what I'd like to do is, by using an example, just give you an intro into that "have you ever wondered" idea. And in fact, what we're going to do is look at something which is common to every single one of us. I wonder if you think about this topic for a second, and this is just by way of illustration. What is the most dangerous journey that you can ever recall taking? Now, for some of you, it'll be etched firmly into your mind. It will be very clear just exactly what happened to you. You'll never forget it. Some of you are probably raking around in memories, thinking about trips that you might have taken, or what happened, or how you would maybe make sense of a question like that. What about life's most treacherous journey? There's a picture taken from the Darien Gap. We see this all the time. There are people moving, vast numbers of people moving to get to Northern Europe, typically from Africa and elsewhere. People moving from South America through Central America to try and get into the United States. We've seen the border chaos happening there all the time. This Darien Gap is an area which borders Colombia and Panama. And it's probably one of the most dangerous patches of territory anywhere on the planet. For people to cross this, there are no roads. There are some drug traffickers, there's some kidnappers, there's some deadly snakes, there's lots of mountainous terrain, there's uncharted swamp. The only way to get across is to navigate about 100 miles of that kind of territory. And people do this for the want of a better life. Well, what about the 4,000 Eritreans who leave their country, head across the 40-plus degrees of heat in the desert to get to Sudan, and then on to Khartoum, and then eventually to the Mediterranean, into Europe. And then, of course, we've seen what happens just this week. Just on Thursday, 2 days ago, the BBC were reporting that a record number of people in small boats had attempted to get across the English Channel, taking on a particularly treacherous journey. But you know, there are even more treacherous journeys that some people have to take every day in life. How about crossing this suspension bridge in the Philippines? I don't fancy that much, but look at these people struggling to get across that stretch of water. Or what about the kids who go to school every day? This is from Indonesia. This is a little girl crossing an aqueduct from her village to get to her school. Now, that aqueduct was never designed for people to walk on, and yet rather than take a 6-kilometre detour, the kids in the local school walk across the aqueduct. And if your eyesight's particularly good, right at the top of the picture, you'll see another person pushing a bike across the said aqueduct. Or what about these little guys? Would you send your kids to school on a craft like this across a fairly rapid river? Little boys going to primary school. There are loads of examples of this kind of thing. My favourite one, I just can't resist showing you. And we need to get to the rainforest here. This is about 40 miles southeast of Bogota. This is a little girl called Daisy Mora, and she is making her way across a ravine above the Rio Negro to get to school. And she does this every day. She hooks herself onto that pulley. It's 800 meters long, high above the river. And what you perhaps don't recognize is that in the sack that's also hooked onto the wire is her wee brother. He's only 5, and he's too young to make the trip on his own. So there she is, hurtling along at 50 miles an hour. The whole trip takes about 60 seconds, and she's using a branch in the shape of a wishbone as a kind of a crude brake. I wonder if you'd let your kids go to school in circumstances like that. But risk is all around us, and it's a fertile way of opening up a conversation. I wonder, for example, some of the things that you might be involved in. Andy said he's a mountaineer. We'll come to that in a minute. But if you happen to be a base jumper, your chance of death is about 1 in every 60 episodes. I'll let you guess the risk of dying from skydiving. You might be surprised. It's only about 1 in 100,000 episodes. So it's relatively safe as these things go. How about wild whitewater canoeing? Well, about 1 in 10,000 chance of dying, depending on the circumstances. And if you're into mountain climbing, particularly the extreme kind of mountain climbing, you know, if you're into Himalayan mountain climbing, above about 26,000 feet, if you choose to do that without oxygen, your chance of death is about between 10 and 12%, it's reckoned. So a very significant risk associated with that. I was going to try and reassure you that we have a risk register for this building, so your presence here has all been carefully calculated. But just look in the mirror every morning and ask yourself the question, what is the risk that I will survive this year? Well, do you know your risk of dying doubles every 8 years? If you happen to be 25, your risk of death within the next year is about 0.03%. That's 3 chances in 10,000. If you're a bit more senior, 95, we're talking about a 50-50 shot. So things change as you get older. But when you think a little bit about risk, what I want to do is just to pick an example from that Himalayan experience and tell you about the risk that's involved there. It's not a surprise that this mountain, Everest, is famous for being the highest mountain in the world. That's the north face, the northeast ridge of Everest. Quite imposing. But what most people don't really understand is that Everest is also known as the world's largest open-air graveyard. Many people attempt to climb that mountain, and some of them never get off the mountain. And the received wisdom is that someone dies in the death zone above about 26,000 feet. I mean, the mountain is 29,035 feet high. Then there's no point in even trying to get the body down. And so these bodies remain there as kind of gruesome mile markers. This is a picture taken in what's known as Green Boots Cave. This is almost certainly an Indian climber who never made it off the mountain. One of life's certainly most treacherous journeys. This, of course, is a picture of the famous men who conquered Everest in 1953. Edmund Hillary, Tenzing Norgay. But there's a very interesting mystery that remains about Everest. And it's quite an interesting story just to briefly tell. And it concerns another group. About 39 years or so before this, back in the 1920s, there were 3 British expeditions, 1921, 1922, 1924, some of them featuring the same individuals. And 2 of them were men who became particularly famous, and they're on that picture. There they are, Sandy Irvine on the left and a man called George Mallory on the right. And in 1924, they went to Everest, and they were last seen making a bid for the summit on the 8th of June that year. And they were seen about 800 or so meters from the summit, finding their way up that northeast ridge. They never came off that mountain. This is a picture of Mallory and his wife. He married his wife in 1914. And his intention was to take the picture that he had of his wife and leave it on the summit of Everest when he conquered the mountain. But he never made it home. And it was a mystery for many years. In fact, for 75 years, what had become of George Mallory. Well, there's what became of George Mallory. On the 1st of May 1999, they found his remains, lying there some distance below that northeast ridge, bleached white, preserved, as you can see, the skin intact. They never found Sandy Irvine. They never found the camera that they had, but they found Mallory. And they knew it was Mallory because inside his collar, his name tag was sewn, G. Mallory, it said. So there was no doubt. And it took 5 pretty healthy, strong climbers about 45 minutes to release his body from the rock in which it was frozen there in order to then go ahead and try and give him a decent burial. But when they examined what he had in his possession on that occasion, they discovered a number of things. In fact, the ice axe that had been, probably Sandy Irvine's ice axe, in fact, had been discovered by the 4th British expedition, which was 1933. And that was found at 27,760 feet, so it was right up there. Mallory, however, had a number of things on his possession. In his pocket, he had his unbroken snow goggles. He had an altimeter. He had a knife. He had a couple of receipts for climbing equipment. He had a letter in his pocket. And what opened up the debate about whether or not they made it to the summit, they never found the camera, of course, nor did they ever find in his possession the photograph of his wife. So the debate remains open. Did he actually make it? Was he on his way back down? But the reality is he died in that most treacherous of journeys. Why do I tell you these tales? Because it gives us an opportunity to open up another of life's most treacherous journeys, one that you've all been on. And one that I'm glad to say, as I look around the audience, you've all managed to survive. So let me just try and briefly describe that to you. Not that you need the detail of this, but just to open up the wonder of it and let you appreciate that, for one thing. But also to show you how, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, it opens up a bridge to that question. Have you ever wondered what the implications of all of this might be? So hold that thought as we take this further. There we are, right at the very beginning of life. This is a coloured scanning electron micrograph of a human spermatozoa and a human ovum, a sperm and an egg. And there they are at the point of contact, making contact, so that's the moment just before fertilization. And if you follow this through, it's very interesting, because then you have the twists and turns of the treacherous journey that turns out to be the journey of embryonic life. So on the left there, that's a picture of an embryo at about 22 days gestation. And then the one on the right, you can begin to see very much looks like a human baby. This is at 56 days. Fast forward to 10 weeks, and the baby begins to look like this. Fast forward another 10 weeks, at 20 weeks of gestation, you can see some significant human features shining through very clearly. Absolutely amazing that that should be the case. So just hold the wonder of it, because another 20 weeks or so further on, you reach the term of the pregnancy. Now, I don't want to be too graphic here, but what then follows is one of the most treacherous journeys that any of us have ever undertaken. And I'm speaking here purely from the baby's point of view, okay? So I'm not saying anything about maternal health or risk or anything like that, just purely from the baby's point of view. I'm going to show you a slide with about 6 pictures. Some of you might wince a little bit when you see this. It's not particularly graphic, but just have a look at what happens during labor. That baby is compressed and pushed and squeezed and pummeled and eventually expelled. The bones in its head actually have to overlap to get it through the birth canal. They monitor the stress by checking its heart rate as it goes very often, just to see how much of a challenge this is, or whether they may have to intervene to save the baby's life. Such is the treachery that's involved in this process. This undoubtedly is one of life's most treacherous journeys. Why do I say that? Well, every year there are something like 140 million births and about 60 million deaths. That's the current situation. But if you think about the risk involved to babies, the number of stillborn babies every year is really quite high. More than 2.5 million babies don't make it down that birth canal. And at least half of them die as a result of the birthing process. And when you go into a little bit more detail, what you find is that in the early neonatal period, another 2.5 million or more people will die. And at least 900,000 of them die because of acute lack of oxygen, what used to be known as birth asphyxia. So all in all, when you put it all together, something like 2 million people every year don't make it through that most treacherous of journeys. And in fact, when you further analyze the information, it's a particular problem in parts of the world where healthcare is not nearly as sophisticated as it is here. So that undoubtedly is one of life's most treacherous journeys. I don't know whether any of you have ever delivered a baby. Some of you will have been delivered of a baby. That's not quite the same thing. It's a kind of weird, strange experience. Babies are incredibly slippery customers, I can tell you. And the one thing that is the overarching anxiety that I've always felt, whether delivering a baby in the conventional route or by an operative delivery, is, my goodness, I hope I don't drop this baby, because they are incredibly slippery. But when that baby is born, it faces 3 immediate challenges. So the treachery is not done yet, because the first thing is that it's been taken unceremoniously from its nice, warm, cosseted, rather dark, comfortable home, and it's out in the freezing outside environment. Secondly, its source of nutrition has suddenly been cut off, and so hypothermia, hypoglycemia are major threats. But the particular threat, the instant threat, is lack of oxygen. That baby needs oxygen, and fast. So it takes its first breath, and of course that's the thing in the labor suite that everyone is waiting for. Sometimes there's a moment of silence, sometimes it's an uncomfortable, prolonged moment of silence, but when the baby screams, all of a sudden the biological machinery begins to turn and some incredible things happen at that point. Because what has to happen there is almost unbelievable, and I can hardly do it justice. But it's the wonder of this that points out something which is absolutely unique about biology, that's not true of inanimate objects at all. And it's this, that there's a goal at the end of the process. There's a purpose in this. And if you can demonstrate purpose, the implication of that is so important for articulating a story about your faith, particularly to a skeptic. Then you'll see how this plays out in just a moment. So as that baby takes its first breath, some very important things happen. These lungs have been filled with fluid up until that point. And of course, you're looking for the end result that is perhaps best personified by this little character. There is an end goal, and the end goal here is undoubtedly the end goal of a healthy baby. So I want to try and describe to you one of the things that has to happen to make sure that that oxygen delivery is intact. Andy's got a copy of my book here, he's mentioned it already, and we've got a bit more of a detailed description of that there, together with some other amazing wonders that are involved. But I want to show you some diagrams that will hopefully make that clear. Some of you with a healthcare background will chew this out very easily, but just for those of you without, this is a picture of the heart and the lungs and the other giblets and so on that are down here. And this is the situation in an adult. The blue is meant to indicate vessels carrying blood from which the oxygen has largely been extracted, and the red conventionally shows oxygen-rich blood. So normally the blood coming back from the rest of the body to the right side of the heart is then sent into the lungs, it picks up its oxygen, and it's then transmitted through the left heart in series, right heart, lungs, left heart, rest of the circulation, and so it goes on, around and around, all discovered by William Harvey back in the 1500s. Amazing story altogether. But a moment's thought will tell you that there is no way that will work for a baby in a uterus. Clearly, something very different is going on, and of course it is. And what's going on here is that the baby gets its oxygen from the maternal circulation in the placenta, and it comes up through the umbilical cord into the umbilical vein, and then there's a series of shunts that convert that adult series circulation into a parallel circulation. And it's really incredibly clever the way it works out. And I want to point out three things. So the first thing is here, so the blood arriving before it even gets to the heart. This is oxygen-rich blood from the placenta making its way back to the heart. And you would think with the turbulent flow as it joins the blood from the rest of the circulation, it would all be mixed up. No. The configuration of the vessels is so incredible that what actually happens there is that the blood from the placenta is maintained in a separate stream, largely unmixed with the oxygen-depleted blood from the rest of the circulation. And it's then channeled through one of the shunts in the heart, which is up here, and it goes through what's known as the foramen ovale. Doctors are into this business of being so pretentious about using Latin terms. It just means an oval hole, a hole in the heart. That's what it is. And the blood bypasses the lungs by going through that little hole there. And then the oxygen-rich blood is sent on round the rest of the circulation. Now you can see what happens when the baby is born. A midwife comes and puts a stonking big clamp on the umbilical cord, so the oxygen is cut off like that. So what has to happen is that these shunts, and there are two of them up in the heart, I won't mention them both for the sake of time, but they have to close. And they have to close one of them more or less instantly. The outcome is a baby that's going to be seriously deprived of life-giving oxygen, and its future will certainly be threatened. If not, death will ensue. There is a close-up picture of what the foramen ovale looks like in an opened diagram of the heart. And what happens is the engineering instantly, when that first breath is taken, all sorts of chemical signals and pressure signals close the hole, and the blood is then directed into the right ventricle and then into the lungs to pick up oxygen from the lungs that are suddenly filled with air. It's an incredible thing. Now think about it. The kind of conventional story that we hear for how these things develop is that, well, you get a little bit of change and then that's fixed in the population, and then you get another little bit of change, and gradually, and this is the Dawkins story of Mount Improbable, then that's how it happens. No, that does not make any sense in a situation like this. All of the components of this have to work right out of the box, or the baby will not survive. And this is just an example of some of the many things that exist in the world of biology that clearly demonstrate some features which show absolute intricacy, sophistication, interlocking, balanced, functional purpose. And if there's purpose, then there has to be an intention behind it. And if there's an intention, then this is the point Andy was making about human rights earlier. You don't ever get to human rights from some kind of inanimate, non-purposeful, non-intentional background. It just does not make sense. It doesn't hang together in any way. And the kind of engineering that's involved here is incredible. And it just makes me think, of an ancient writer, and you'll recognize this, many of you, when you see this taken from Psalm 139. It's very clear there. David wrote this. You created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. So how can you persuade someone that this engineering is not something which is just random chance? It's all just the result of an accident. That video that's running there is a video which shows the robotic machinery in the Tesla plant manufacturing cars. Never for one moment would you imagine that that wasn't put together for a purpose, wasn't intentional, wasn't incredibly, intricately sophisticated and designed in such a way to produce the end result. And exactly the same thing applies. Actually, it's much more complicated in the human world. What we have here is evidence of purpose. It's intentional. It's goal-directed. And when you identify these features, it's very clear that there must be some kind of designer, some kind of transcendent, creative mind behind it all. This points actually beyond something which is just something accidental, materialistic, just happened. That makes no sense. In fact, it's a preposterous condition. That's the engineering. Scale it up a little bit, and the same thing applies whether you're looking at the origin of the universe or the origin of life or the nanotechnology that runs the cell, or Andy mentioned it already, consciousness. We have no explanation for these things beyond that there must be a transcendent source. This is information, evidence, which points indubitably to a creator. If we try and bat that away and say, well, no, it's all just chance, you're running very much counter to the way that the evidence is presented. And here's the additional thing, and this is the point that I didn't realize Andy was going to mention, but I was going to mention this too. People are very into human rights and into dignity and autonomy and value and medical ethics, and we have an intuitive sense that all of these things apply. We are about something. We are intentional beings. We have a purpose. But if we're all just particles in motion, there's no purpose. There's no human rights. There's no dignity. None of that applies. It doesn't have any sense because there's no grounding for any of it. So you see, when you just simply look at the wonder of us, and you don't have to look at the fetal circulation, you can look at the design of the eye, or you can look at the knee joint, it's pretty incredible, or look at the counter-current exchange mechanism in the kidney, or look at the way the brain works. All of these are incredible examples of the intentionality and the purpose that God has built into our being. So just encourage your interlocutor, your colleague, your friend, whoever, have you ever wondered? Because if they recognize the design and recognize the purpose and recognize the intentionality, the logical implication of that is that there must be a mind behind the whole thing. And that is the basis for value, for purpose, for this business of intentionality that I've mentioned, and for equity and other aspects of human rights. At the end of the day, and with this I'm going to finish, this comes down to a question of ultimate reality, I think. People have opposing views about this, and it's important to recognize this framework so that you know what you're dealing with. So many people would think that we're just accidents. It's just all natural processes. The laws of physics have made it all possible. Well, I've tried to show you evidence that certainly challenges that idea and points much more in the direction of theism. This doesn't get you to the gospel. This doesn't get you to the Christian God, but it gets a skeptic thinking, actually, there's maybe something here that I need to follow up and be more inquisitive about. Because in reality, these two are opposites. If you're materialist, matter and energy is the ultimate reality, and from that, the idea of God emerges. But if you're a theist, God is responsible for the whole process. And he is responsible for the matter and energy. And actually, when you look at the evidence around us, that makes much more sense. This is clearly evidence of top-down engineering. And just taking that example of life's most treacherous journey, it gets us to that point. And with that, I pretty much conclude. But I want to just remind you of something else that an early Christian proponent made in a point to some skeptics that he was engaging with in a European city, the city of Athens. And I'm going to read it to you, because this little section from Acts chapter 17 says this. And this is talking about God. This was the famous Apostle Paul. He said, "From one man he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from any of us." And then he says, "For in him we live and move and have our being." The Bible says that all of this biological complexity, all of this humanity is sustained, not just made, sustained by his powerful word. What an incredible encouragement that is. But can you see the connection? The connection is if there's purpose, there has to be an intentional, powerful, immaterial, personal designer behind the whole thing. That's an indication of the theistic position, a pointer very definitely towards God. And that's a way to break into that topic with someone who might be skeptical. Have you ever wondered? And just to round it off, when we think about life's most treacherous journey, the warning and the encouragement is that if someone wants to completely disregard that, then they are facing what the Bible calls an even more treacherous future journey. Ladies and gentlemen, that's another story. I'm going to hand back to Andy.
Thank you for that, David. And I hope your minds are suitably sort of wowed by the content. I always love listening to David share. Well, in about 5 minutes' time, we're just going to have a refreshment break. So if after all that we've thrown at you for the last hour, your mind is feeling in need of a little bit of sugar and caffeine, we have that all available. But before that, just want to take a few moments just to tell you a little bit about Solas, the organisation that I lead, based in Dundee. And actually, David was very modest, because actually David's one of our board of trustees as well. So there's quite a strong sort of Solas connection here today. So Solas is an organisation, Scottish-based organisation, covering the whole of the country, focusing really on two things. We love doing evangelism training. We love putting events on like this, and now that the COVID restrictions are easing, it's fantastically exciting to be back on the road again. And we take this event in larger forms and smaller forms across the country, and regularly have the privilege of training men and women how to share their faith with their friends. But the thing that really gets us the most excited is we're also an evangelism organisation. So actually, the thing I'm most excited about, I love spending the afternoon with you guys, but this evening, when there may be some guests and folks with no faith coming to dinner, hugely excited about that. And we love working with churches to help them put on dinners and events in curry houses and coffee shops and workplaces and universities. We get very excited at seeing how the Lord moves. In fact, even last year, when things were a bit restricted during lockdown, one of my highlights of the year was helping the Christian Union at Nottingham Trent University down there in the Midlands. They'd moved all of their mission week online, and it was complicated making things work on Zoom, but we made it. Lots of non-Christians came. We actually found it easier to get people to come to those events, sometimes with just a screen, and then had really great response at the end. And then I had the privilege a few weeks later of being involved in the follow-up and having a small group of a mixture of agnostics and atheists and a couple of Muslims all on this discussion group who wanted to go further in the stuff they learned on Mission Week. And the highlight for me was watching this young woman who started as quite a hardline atheist, but she still comes to the follow-up, so there was something there. And about 2 or 3 sessions in, she was actually answering the objections of others against Christianity. and then about 4 or 5 weeks later came through to faith in Christ. And those kind of stories get us tremendously excited. Equally, the stuff we see going on in cafes and coffee shops shortly before lockdown. Just down the road in Glasgow, we worked with a church there to put on an event in a curry house. We said to the church, can you find a nice neutral venue? And they went, well, this is an amazing Indian restaurant opposite the church. What do you think? And I went, fantastic, curry and conversation. What more do you want? And we packed the place out back in the days when you could do that more easily with a mixture of Christians and non-Christians. And it was just so encouraging to see quite a large number of visitors sign up for the Christianity Explored course. And so we love doing that kind of stuff with churches across the country as well as the training. And we also do lots at Solas online as well. And on your seats, you will see this wee little leaflet with persuasive evangelism on the front, which will tell you more about what Solas does. Do encourage you to check out the Solas website. We have actually probably now thousands of free resources there to help equip you in evangelism, for sharing with your friends. We do a video series called Short Answers, where every 2 weeks we take a common challenge to the Christian faith. We do a 4 or 5 minute video addressing it in a very accessible way. And we've had something like 2 million downloads and views on that video series in the last 3 or 4 years. Really powerful tool if you're thinking about sharing your faith with your friends, because you have the confidence that even if you get asked that question you're not sure about, you can say, you know what, I know someone who can answer it, and you can pull the phone out and show your friend. Or if you're one of the people, these folks who love social media, they're great for sharing on social media too. And also, if you do check out the Solas website, hugely encouraged, particularly those of you who are in the workplace or at university, there's a series we're running this year called Frontlines, where every 2 weeks we interview a Christian in a different workplace setting. In fact, our very first episode was a pilot episode. We thought we quite liked the joke there. And we've had pilots and doctors and teachers and office workers and students and so forth, just telling us in an interview every couple of weeks how they share their faith in the workplace. And if you're sitting there today thinking, well, how do I do it? There's a very good chance there'll be someone in that series just like you. Well, it's been a real privilege the last 5 or 6 years leading Solas. There is nothing like it in Scotland in terms of a small organisation that really seeks to work in and through churches. And the way that we're funded, you knew there was a little bit of a request coming at the end of this. The way that we're funded, some organisations get large trusts to write them huge amounts of large cheques, and that's how they do it. We do it through having a growing army of men and women across the country who give us a tiny amount of money kind of each month to help us do what we do, and also that means we also can get you praying for us and feeling you're part of things. If you've enjoyed this afternoon, if you don't already support Solas, if you do, by the way, thank you. If you don't already support Solas, just prayerfully ask that you might just consider that today. There's a leaflet on your seats. This one is the other one, and you can fill in your details there. Bring that to us at the bookstall, and as a thank you for supporting Solas, we have a very special offer for you today, because this is the first of these events we've done in a while, what with COVID. If you sign up to support Solas for £3 a month, you can pick any book, one of mine, one of David Galloway's, any book you like. If you sign up to support us for £5 a month, it's 2 books. £10 a month, we will give you 4 books, and £20 a month, 6 of the things. You can just fill your trunk. That's still Canadian. Fill your boot, and kind of thing, because we love thanking people for supporting us. So the form is on the seat. Bring that to us at the bookstall, and we'd love to exchange that for some books into your hot little hands this afternoon. Well, without further ado, we're going to break now for some tea and coffee and sugary things, and we will recommence here at 3 o'clock when we're going to look at the question of God and suffering together. But if you want to grab David or I, we'll be at the bookstall at the back. So see you in half an hour. and all those kind of wonderful things. And I confess I had 2 pieces of the millionaire shortbread, so my sugar levels are somewhere near the ceiling, which means this talk is probably going to be twice as fast as the previous ones. Well, I hope you found that first session on practical tools for sharing our faith helpful, and then David's session on brilliant, excellent. Someone is going to go and round the rabble up in the cafe. It's always the ones at the back who cause the most trouble, isn't it? It's just always the way. Brilliant. Okay, come grab a seat. That's excellent. Well, in this third session, I'm going to talk to you for a short while about the whole question of how we make sense of suffering. Is the question we're thinking about for the next 25 minutes or so. And as I said at the start of the first session, if you would like the slides from my 3 talks, previous one, this one, and the next one, also David's, don't forget to pop your email address down on the wee slip of paper and get that to us before the end of the day. Thank you to the folks who've done that already, and we'll get you those slides kind of next week. So let's talk then about suffering for a short while together this afternoon. And it's interesting, as I think back of over sort of 20 years of doing evangelism in public places, in universities and workplaces and on the street and so on and so forth. The questions come and go. The different times and seasons, different questions. But probably questions about suffering are some of the most common ones I hear about the Christian faith. Either people who use it as a massive objection, or people who are struggling with it and wrestling with it and trying to make sense of it. And I think that one of the reasons for that, of course, is that suffering is the great leveler, isn't it? It's the great leveler. It doesn't matter what your race or your sex or your gender, your politics, your income level. All of us are going to face suffering at some point in life, whether it directly affects us personally or whether it affects people that we care about. And the question of how we understand suffering and how we respond to it, how we live with it, doesn't matter whether you're a Christian, like we are here this afternoon, or you have a different faith or no faith. Every one of us has to at some point think through how we respond to suffering. But of course, we're thinking about the question of suffering this afternoon in a particular context, aren't we? We're still on the tail end, hopefully on the tail end, of the pandemic, the COVID crisis. And so probably in the middle of a cultural moment where people are asking the suffering question more than ever. I've had lots of conversations in the past 18 months around where is God in all of this, and so on and so forth. So what I really want to do this afternoon is to use the COVID pandemic as a way into the suffering question. It gives us a really helpful, I think, window to explore this question this afternoon. Also, I hope it will also give a sort of practical component to it, that some of what I share will be helpful, either perhaps if you're wrestling with these questions yourselves, or you want to be able to talk to your friends and neighbours and colleagues about your faith, and you're aware this might be a question they might be concerned with. So hopefully that will help keep us earthed a little bit. Well, of course, the COVID pandemic raises all kinds of questions, and it certainly raises spiritual questions, and we'll come to those in a moment. But also, I find it fascinating that the pandemic has also raised all kinds of other interesting questions that can lead in interesting places in conversations with people. You see, one of the big questions that the pandemic raised for me early on is this whole question of the limits of science. For some time now, our society has sort of been living under the assumption that, science can answer every important question, all the important questions that matter. In fact, early in the pandemic, politicians were telling us, if you recall, time and time again, we heard the mantra, we're following the science. In fact, when the vaccine breakthrough happened, I think it was Nicola Sturgeon who used the words, "Science has saved us," and actually put those two ideas together. But then, of course, it turned out that different scientists believed different things and disagreed with each other. There were different vaccines and all the controversies that we're now surrounded with. And it turns out that there is, in fact, no such thing as the science, capital T and capital S. And, of course, it turns out that the biggest questions we have faced as a society and still do are actually not scientific questions, but they're political questions, economic questions, ethical questions, and so on. So that's intrigued me But the other thing that intrigued me throughout the COVID pandemic is the fact that as human beings, is the fact that we struggle with suffering so much. You know, when suffering strikes, as it has for many of us in the pandemic, isn't it interesting that most people start asking why questions? You know, I've talked to friends who have no religious faith who would come out with words like, well, why did this happen to us? You know, why was it my family member who ended up on a ventilator? Why did my loved one die? And it's interesting that when life goes wrong, you know, for me, even the most hardened skeptic doesn't tend to just reach for the secular answer. We don't reach for the, we're just atoms in motion answer. But whenever life goes wrong, we start asking the why questions. You know, why has this happened? Why is the universe this way? Although, of course, on atheism, there is no why. There's simply, the universe is the way it is, and there's nothing you can ask any further. You know, one of the most famous atheists of all time was the gentleman on the screen behind me. This is Friedrich Nietzsche, 19th century atheist, also possessor, arguably, of the most amazing moustache in the history of philosophy. And he once said something very interesting. Nietzsche once said these words. He said, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. In other words, what he was saying is that when suffering and adversity strikes, those who have found something bigger than themselves, those who have found answers to life's biggest questions, have found some meaning to live for, says Nietzsche, they are more easily going to be able to weather the storms of life. But of course, our secular society, I think, has struggled to answer that question. You know, our secular society has largely done its best to offer people false hopes. You know, if you trust in your, make your work the center of your life, or make money, or sport, or politics, or happiness, or sex the center of your life, everything will be okay. But then, of course, COVID has come along and kicked out the legs from under all of those things, and they failed a lot of people. And they failed for a reason, actually, that another atheist identified. More recent atheist, well, maybe more of an agnostic, actually, than Nietzsche, is this gentleman, David Foster Wallace. David was a Pulitzer Prize-nominated writer, wrote some absolute best-selling novels, very famous, influential literary figure, more on the American side of the water, but over here too, until his death a few years ago. And no religious faith, as far as I know. And I stress no religious faith because his reflection on this question of meaning is fascinating. And in fact, I was talking about, before the coffee break, that little plug I gave for Solas, and some of the things that we've seen God do at university missions. The quote I'm about to put on the screen, I had up at an event at Dundee University a few years ago, and there was a skeptic of a student who'd walked in, invited by a friend, walked in as I was reading this quote, and was so struck by what David Foster Wallace said, that led to a conversation with a Christian friend of his at Kentucky Fried Chicken that lasted till 3 in the morning, and him coming to faith about 2 months later. What did David Foster Wallace say that really intrigued this atheist student? Let me read to you what David says. He says, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. If you worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die 1,000,000 deaths before they finally plant you. Worship power, and you will feel weak and afraid. You will need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, and you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out, and so on. I think he nails it totally, actually. And I think, of course, the pandemic has exposed many of those false gods that he talks about, that people are tempted to worship, as utterly hopeless. All the things that people normally run towards for comfort, friendship and job and career and, an easy holiday, a holiday in France and all these other kind of things, they've all been toppled, well, if not toppled entirely, weakened considerably, certainly in the height of the pandemic. And I think many people found themselves going, what on earth is going on? Because the secular world doesn't really have an answer to Nietzsche's question about our need for a why in times of suffering. So if secularism can't do it, if Nietzsche really can't answer his own question, what's the Christian answer? What can, as Christians, we say about suffering and so forth? Where is God in the midst of the coronavirus crisis? Where is God in the middle of any suffering? Why would God allow suffering in the first place? Or sometimes people are tempted to answer those kind of questions by suggesting that the existence of suffering disproves God. You know, the idea goes, well, if there was a God, there wouldn't be all this suffering. There is all this suffering, therefore there is no God, QED. But of course, things aren't quite that straightforward. You know, one of the first problems here, of course, is if suffering was, you know, an immediate knockout blow against the existence of God, you have to wonder, how did belief in God ever get going in the first place? As the late Oxford philosopher C.S. Lewis, known to perhaps many of us here who love his writings in different forms, Lewis pointed this out in his famous book, The Problem of Pain, where Lewis writes, he says, if the universe is so bad, or even half so bad as the pessimists claim, how on earth did human beings ever come to attribute it to the activity of a wise and good creator? Humans are fools, perhaps, but hardly so foolish as that. The direct inference from black to white, from evil flower to virtuous root, from senseless work to a workman infinitely wise, staggers belief. Of course, what Lewis is getting at is going, you know, religious belief arose in a context in which life was cheap and brutish and short. You know, our ancestors knew far more about suffering and pain than we know today, and yet they still believed fervently in the goodness of God in the case of the early Christians. And we either have to conclude, which smells rather like chronological snobbery, that everyone born before about 1950 was just stupid, or we have to perhaps realize with humility that maybe they had something figured out that our society has forgotten. There's also, of course, the issue that if you throw God out of the window, you are still left with the suffering. You know, if you are facing bereavement or sickness or financial ruin or whatever it is that you are wrestling with, I have this conversation regularly with people and say, look, it's hard, I can understand, you know, your pain in terms of what you're going through, but throwing God out the window doesn't take the pain away. All it does actually is take away one powerful resource to help deal with it. In fact, I experienced this personally myself, because in my early 20s, I went through quite a sort of rough time of life. I ended up with stress and burnout and depression diagnosed by my GP. And for 6 months in my mid-20s, I would say life felt very much not worth living. And my GP tried the usual things. We tried counseling, we tried antidepressants, all those other kind of things. But during all of those horrible, horrible weeks around about the age of 24, you know, I remember thinking, looking back now, the one thing that it never even occurred to me to contemplate was to turn away from God. Because despite all the mess and the chaos, God at times felt like the one thing I was clinging to when everything else was in utter chaos. And I didn't get an answer to the why question, but I had that experience of at least having something holding me up when everything else was going mad. And so I'm fully convinced, as someone who's now been a follower of Jesus for about 40 years, that Christianity has some unique things to say about suffering and pain and loss and all these other things that actually no other belief system does out there. And so what I want to do in the sort of last 12 minutes of this talk is share with you four key ideas that I think lie at the heart of a Christian answer to pain and suffering that I've certainly found helpful, and I found helpful when I've shared them with others, whether sharing them with non-Christian friends or with other believers who are struggling. First idea that I think is hugely important when it comes to the whole question of God and suffering, the first thing that really matters is it makes a huge difference which God we are talking about. In fact, I wrote a whole book earlier this year called Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? That's one of the books in the book offer that I talked about before the coffee break, because it's a very common assumption in our culture that all gods are the same. And all conceptions of God are not the same. They're wildly different. And so when we ask the question, you know, why would God allow suffering, or where is God in suffering, it matters which God we're talking about. For example, if the God who created the universe is a sort of Stalinistic monster who loves torturing people because he finds pain pleasurable and fun to watch, then that leads to one set of answers. Equally, if you believe in a God who's a kind of distant God who kind of wound up the clockwork of the universe and then disappeared off for an eternal tea break never to be seen again, that leads to yet another answer. And you see, the major religions of the world differ tremendously on those questions. You know, some of the world's great faith traditions teach that God just controls everything and you can't even ask why. Some of the world's great faith traditions will teach you that suffering is an illusion. Others will tell you that the reason you're suffering now, well, it's karma. The reason that you're suffering now is because in a previous life you did something wicked, even though you can't remember it, so it's all just in the end. But the Bible, of course, would reject those answers wholeheartedly. The Bible claims something very, very different, that God is a God of love, a God who designed us for a relationship with him and with one another, a God who created us not as robotic automata pre-programmed to obey, but who gave us the gift of freedom, because without true freedom, we would never know love. And that's a very, very unique concept of God, certainly very different, interestingly, from the God of Islam. But that's another discussion for another time. So that is which God we're talking about. Secondly, the Bible is very, very honest that the world is not as it should be. You know, I sometimes talk to skeptics or those outside the Christian faith who, you know, raise the question of suffering as if it's something which should come as a surprise. You know, there's a Christian, I would suddenly go, what, there's suffering? I hadn't noticed, really. The Bible doesn't duck the question. The Bible is not surprised by the question of suffering. And the Bible is also very honest that one of the reasons why the world is suffering is the world is not functioning right now the way it should do. And that may sound a sort of fairly obvious thing to say, but it's quite a crucial thing to say. Because, of course, on atheism, the world is functioning exactly the way it should function. The atoms and the particles and the laws of physics, they're all doing their thing. They're functioning the way they've always functioned. And yes, you know, the way that one particular configuration of atoms may be behaving right now, if I've got the coronavirus inside me, it might be quite annoying that a virus is doing its thing. But all it's doing is following laws of physics, and I'm following laws of physics, and so on and so forth. There's nothing actually wrong with anything. But for the Bible, of course, the Bible is very clear that something has gone wrong. That evil and suffering and pain are an intrusion. They're a cancer, as it were, into God's good world. Which, of course, raises the question, okay, where did they come from? And the Bible explains that answer in terms of when human beings rebelled against God, right at the beginning, when we turned our back on him, rejecting him and wanting to be God in his place, some consequences happened. And, of course, one of the things that you reflect on that for a moment, it suddenly reminds you that one of the humbling observations about suffering and pain is how much human beings are caught up in all of it. You know, there's a tendency we sometimes have as humans to separate things like disease and natural disasters, and we label them suffering, and then we talk about crime and violence, and we label that evil. But, of course, it's not so easy to separate those things, right? You know, if you catch coronavirus and you are in a rich Western nation with good medical care and access to vaccinations, your potential life outcomes are going to be very different from if you're in some very poor part of the world where, because of poverty and structural injustice, you don't have access to any of those things. You know, if you live in a very poor country and an earthquake strikes, you are possibly in real trouble. If you live in a rich country like America, my sister-in-law lived in Los Angeles for many years, lived through earthquakes, hardly batted an eyelid most times because they had the structure there to deal with it. You can't separate things like earthquakes and pandemics from things like poverty and injustice quite so easily. It does seem that human beings have got evil all over our fingerprints. The same, interestingly, goes for one of the big issues of our day, which they've been talking about just down the road for the last 2 weeks, which is the whole issue of climate and everything that's gone wrong with the environment. And again, it's very easy to kind of to read some of those issues the wrong way. But one of my favorite writers on these issues is a guy called Gus Speth, who is one of the USA's leading climate scientists. And Gus made a fascinating observation a few years ago. Again, like David Foster Wallace, I think Gus is an agnostic. He's got no Christian faith. But I think what he said about climate issues applies equally to environment issues, applies to a whole range of suffering, actually. Gus writes, he says, I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address those problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and a cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. And of course, you read those words, and go, well, actually, all of us, if we're honest, right, can be greedy. We can be selfish. We can be apathetic when we've got the energy to. I can't be bothered half the time to be apathetic. We've broken faith with God and with each other. We've damaged not just ourselves, but also creation. And that's interesting, again, because I find it fascinating that when we see injustice, or we see things going wrong in the world, even my skeptical friends are not tempted to say, well, you know what, I'm just atoms in motion. But our instinctive reaction is to go, that's not fair. That's unjust. We need to organize a conference to solve those problems and put things right. The world is not as it should be. I say, absolutely right. The Bible would agree with that diagnosis. So firstly, it matters which God you're talking about. Secondly, the Bible is very honest that something has gone wrong with the world. Thirdly, penultimately, that the Bible tells us that God has done something about the root cause of the suffering and the problem. You see, in a world of suffering and pain, what we actually need is not something said about the problem. We don't just need to sit around and have words, but actually when it comes to suffering and injustice and pain and evil, what we need, of course, is something done about the problem. Now, when it comes to solving the problem of suffering, of course, God could solve all the problems in the world simply by removing us. He could take the Etch-a-Sketch approach to the problem and just shake the thing and wipe us all out and be done with it. That would certainly solve the problem of suffering. If God snapped his fingers, metaphorically, and removed every human being, that would solve the problem. God could equally turn each one of us into robots. He could remove our freedom. We would no longer be free, which means we couldn't do a whole range of things like love and think and so on, but we certainly couldn't worsen suffering. So God could take that route, but it would have some pretty drastic consequences. So then, if God doesn't wish to either wipe us out or just remove our humanity entirely, how might a God who is loving and wants us to be free to love in return respond? Well, we'd expect a loving person to respond to all that's gone on the world with compassion. Compassion is the obvious response to suffering. Now, compassion is a very interesting word, actually. Compassion is what linguists call a compound word. It consists of two smaller words put together. It consists of the word com, which means with, and parte, passion, meaning suffer. And compassion literally means to help in such a way that it costs you dearly. It actually means to get involved in the problem, to step in and do something such that it costs you personally. And of course, the Bible says that's what God has done. Because the very heart of the Bible's message when it comes to suffering and pain is the news of a God who hasn't just said something about suffering. The God of the Bible simply hasn't gone, here are my lecture notes, go have a look and get the PowerPoint presentation afterwards. He's not a God who sat up there with the theologians and ivory towers and given us ponderous works of theology, but a God who has in the cross and in Jesus done something about evil and suffering, who has stepped into this world of tears and pain, taken on the very worst that evil can do head on, and then defeated it ultimately when he went to the cross in the person of Jesus. And he did that, of course, to deal with the evil that has taken root in our hearts, that has wrecked our lives and has wrecked our world too. And Christians, of course, believe that in Jesus what we see is God's rescue plan, God's ultimate answer to pain and suffering and death, and it was one that cost him dearly. But then fourthly, as we just bring this to a close, so we see it matters which God we're talking about. We see that the Bible is very honest that something has gone wrong with the world. We see that the Bible tells us that God has done something. And then lastly, that the God of the Bible doesn't desert us when suffering comes. Yes, God has defeated the powers of evil on the cross. Their days are numbered. But right now, though, because we live between that happening and Christ coming again, we may still experience suffering and pain. But here the Bible offers something so much more profound than those secular gods that David Foster Wallace talked about, those things that we can be tempted to worship: money, sex, power, success, false gods that let us down when the going gets tough. Rather, the Bible tells us that rather than disappear when the going gets tough, God steps in when the going gets tough. And it's been the experience of millions of Christians down through the ages that even when life is at its toughest, there is that sense, or there can be that sense of the presence of God with you in the middle of the darkness, just like it was like that for me in my 20s. And in one of the most famous verses of the Bible, in Psalm 23, of course, we read those famous words where the psalmist says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you, O Lord, are with me." And I love the honesty here too. The Bible doesn't deny the reality of the shadow of death. It doesn't say, hey, there is no shadow of death. It's all an illusion. But it does say that God is with us there in the middle of it. And so I've long appreciated the Bible's honesty about this whole question. Unlike atheism, which ultimately has to conclude there's actually nothing wrong with suffering. That's just the way the world is. Unlike other religions like Islam, which say it's all just the will of Allah, you can't possibly ask questions. Or Eastern religions that try and blame you and say it's just all about your karma, you've just got to live with it. The Bible is very honest that the world is broken, as are we, but that's not the end of the story because God has put a rescue plan into effect. And I often say to people who want to ask the question, where is God in all of this? So actually, God hasn't moved, but it is we as human beings who sometimes are tempted to turn our backs and walk away. And sometimes it takes something dramatic like a pandemic to wake us up to the fact that actually, without God, there is no hope, there is no meaning, there is no peace. In fact, C.S. Lewis said that pain can sometimes function a bit like a megaphone to wake us up to the realities of life. And that without God, there is no hope, no meaning, no peace. But of course, with God, there is. In and through Jesus, we can have all of those things. And so to those in this room who are hurting or struggling or despairing, or the message I would love you to take to your friends who are hurting or despairing or struggling, is those wonderful words of Jesus, where Jesus said, come to me, all who are heavy laden, and I will give you peace. Okay, well, again, thank you for listening. We've got one more talk to come before we have some Q&A. What we're going to do, we're going to take what we call a stretch break, because just aware that we're throwing lots of kind of content at you, and it's good to just take some processing time. So we're just going to give you 5 minutes, not least while I change the PowerPoint slides over. And so feel free to stretch, talk to the person next to you, use the facilities, visit the bookstore, get a cup of tea, all kinds of options. The number of ways you can use 5 minutes is near infinite. And we will then restart at 25 to 4 for our last session. this afternoon. And of course, if the resurrection happened, that vindicates all of Jesus' claims about himself. Jesus made some pretty exalted claims, but of course he rose from the dead, then all of those claims appear to be validated. And the other thing about the resurrection, it also doesn't just answer the question, is there a God? It tells us what kind of God we're talking about, the kind of God who would raise Jesus from the dead. But what I find particularly fascinating about all of this, of course, is the resurrection is a historical claim. If you think about it, it's a claim that a man, Jesus Christ, was in history, was arrested and tried, executed and buried and rose from the dead 3 days later. That's an actual historical claim. And of course, if Jesus didn't rise and die in history, sometime around about AD 33, then Christianity is useless. So how might we construct a historical case for the resurrection? If we're talking with somebody who's intrigued or even sort of skeptical, hostile, why do you Christians believe in something so outlandish as the resurrection? What can we say? What reason can we give for the hope that we have, as 1 Peter 3:15 puts it? Well, I want to suggest to you this afternoon there are 5 basic facts. 5 facts, interestingly enough, that are agreed upon by virtually all historians, be they Christian, agnostic, Jewish, secular, or miscellaneous. 5 facts that we need to explain, and I think the bodily resurrection of Jesus is by far overwhelmingly the best explanation for them. Let me show you the 5 facts I have in mind, and then I'll walk you through them very briefly. 5 facts of history. There's the fact that Jesus was crucified and killed. There was the fact that his tomb was discovered empty early on the Sunday following his death by a group of his women followers. There was the fact that his disciples had experiences in which they believed the risen Jesus had appeared to them. There's the fact that doubters and skeptics encountered the risen Jesus and were converted. And there's the fact that the early church began founded on a belief in Jesus' resurrection. So we're going to explore each of those 5 facts in just a little detail this afternoon. And as I say, if you like this presentation, these slides, make sure you give us your email address by the end of the afternoon, and we'll send you this slide deck so you can look at this and perhaps practice it and try it out with somebody. So the first fact then, Jesus was killed by crucifixion. Well, the fact that Jesus was arrested, tortured, and killed by the Roman authorities sometime around about AD 33 is arguably one of the best attested facts of ancient history. In fact, as John Dominic Crossan, who's a skeptical historian, as John put it, he said that Jesus was crucified is as sure as anything historical ever can be. In other words, if you can't believe the crucifixion, there's really nothing in history we can believe because the evidence is so overwhelming. So why is a skeptic like him, so certain that, we could be sure that Jesus was crucified? Well, firstly, of course, there'd be no reason for the first Christians to invent the crucifixion. Remember, the first Christians were largely Jewish. They believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and the Messiah was supposed to overthrow and, sort of kick the Romans out of things. He wasn't supposed to... Brilliant, thank you for trying to solve the power issue on the laptop there. He wasn't supposed to get killed by the Romans. And so the fact the crucifixion happened was deeply embarrassing for the early Christians. And, oh, there goes the PowerPoint, never mind. When you get it restarted, hang on, I might need to put my password in, just one moment. We on? We good? The cable, here. Okay. Sorry about that. There we go. Fantastic. There we go. We'll see if we get the slides back. If not, then all the more reason to give us your email, right? So to go. Nothing else. I've got the joy of watching David Galloway dance around under the desk trying to plug things in. It's like watching bypass surgery going on back there. It's very exciting. So it was very embarrassing for the first Christians when it came to the crucifixion. But it's also interesting, of course, the crucifixion is mentioned, is attested by non-Christian ancient writers. You've got people like the Roman historian Tacitus, who tells us about the crucifixion. So he tells us, he writes, he says, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class of people hated for their abomination, called Christians by the population. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So it's great to have there you have the crucifixion, you have Pontius Pilate. All those details attested by a Roman historian, not a Christian writer. So Jesus was crucified. Well, okay, if we're going to be hyper-skeptical this afternoon, okay, he was crucified, but how can we be sure he actually died? How can we be sure he actually died? Maybe he just, passed out on the cross and the disciples, smuggled an extra strong coffee to him, each Sunday morning and brought him back with a bit of caffeine and sugar. How can we be sure he actually died there? Well, we can say a couple of things on this. Firstly, the Romans were very, very skilled at crucifying people. Crucifixion was an agonizing death. The Romans had spent years figuring out how to make it as effective as possible. And of course, as a Roman soldier, if you look at this, wonderful. If you were a Roman soldier and you failed to kill your victim, you would end up on the cross yourself. So Roman soldiers are pretty good at the whole crucifixion business. And in fact, interestingly though, a few decades ago, I think back in the 80s, a group of medics writing in the Journal of the American Medical Association, they actually analyzed the details you can extract from the Gospels of what happened to Jesus and sort of did an analysis of medically what we can say. And at the end of this very long analysis of the Gospel accounts from a medical perspective, concluded, they wrote, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appeared to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. In other words, you're simply having a laugh if you can suggest that somebody could sustain the kind of injuries that we can see described there in the Gospel accounts. So we can be sure that Jesus was killed. Second fact of history, Jesus' tomb was discovered empty. So the second fact that we're concerned with this afternoon is the fact that according to early multiple accounts of what happened that first Easter Sunday morning, Jesus' tomb was found empty, first by a group of his women followers early on the Sunday morning following his crucifixion. And the empty tomb, of course, then very quickly becomes part of the preaching of the early church. The first Christians talk about it all the time. And most historians, whatever their religious beliefs, are pretty convinced that the empty tomb is very well supported historically for a number of reasons. Firstly, there's what's been termed the Jerusalem factor. Christianity began in Jerusalem, but that was where Jesus was crucified and buried. Yet his followers are running around the city proclaiming his resurrection. So, of course, here's the problem. If the followers of Jesus are proclaiming the resurrection, all the while there's a tomb with a body in it, it would have taken a lot of effort for the authorities who wanted to stamp out this nonsense to go, no, he isn't risen from the dead, here's his tomb. For a couple of shekels, we'll give you the tour. They don't do that. The authorities don't point to a rotting body or a tomb in a hill or any of those things. What they actually do is something else entirely. Because preserved in the Gospels, we have this really interesting insight into the story that the authorities were putting around. Do you remember what the authorities were actually spreading? What the story was that the Jewish leadership was spreading around? Well, Matthew records it for us in Matthew 28, where apparently the authorities are putting this story about that the disciples stole the body. Well, why would you bother putting that story round if you had a tomb with a body in it? The authorities are stuck with the problem of an empty tomb. And so the enemies of the church come up with this idea of saying, well, the reason it's empty is the disciples stole it. So notice the fun fact here. The church and the opponents of the early church are actually agreed on the fact in front of them. The tomb is empty. The point of disagreement is over why it's empty. But then we also have the additional fun fact that it was women who were the discoverers of the empty tomb early on that Sunday morning. Now, of course, we live in an age that is a pretty equal age. We still have a few problems to work on in terms of equality between the genders, but we're largely an age of equality. In the ancient world, that wasn't the case. The women were not considered equal as citizens to men, and certainly the testimony of women was not considered to be anything near as important or significant as the testimony of men. And so in the ancient world, in the Greco-Roman world, if you were making these stories up, if you were the early church inventing this stuff, trying to get your story to be taken seriously, you would be smoking goodness knows what if you got it into your head that the way to do this was to have frightened women there as the discoverers of the empty tomb. In fact, one of the accusations that pagan critics of the early church threw around was, oh, these are the stories of frightened women. In fact, in Luke 24, we read the disciples didn't believe the women at first. They thought they were all overly emotional. But the fact that the women are all there, what is going on? If you're making these stories up, why not have Peter, James, or John, reliable, male, Jewish witnesses there? What on earth are the women doing in all those Easter Sunday morning stories? Well, the only conclusive, the only logical answer historians have concluded is they're there because that's what really, really happened. Everybody knew it. Everyone in the early church knew it was the women who had found the tomb empty. And even though that might have caused a credibility issue with pagan critics, the story was still told in its unvarnished form. So fact number 1, Jesus was killed. Fact number 2, there was an empty tomb. Fact number 3, we come to the resurrection appearances. And of course, if you read our early records in the New Testament, you can see that numerous examples are reported of times when Jesus appeared to his followers. And there's a number of fascinating features about the resurrection appearances in the New Testament. One of the things that's really interesting, actually, that historians find fascinating is they're so diverse. For example, Jesus appears, if you read the Gospels, he appears to men and to women. He appears to believers and to skeptics. He appears to single individuals and to groups ranging in size from 2 to 500. Indoors, outdoors, in Judea and Galilee. He appears in the countryside and the city. He appears close up and at a distance. He appears in the morning, the evening. He appears on a hill, by a lake, on a road. And he appears sitting and standing and walking. And that immediately makes it pretty unlikely that we're dealing with hallucinations here. Hallucinations not merely tend to happen to one person at a time. They tend to happen when that person's in a very emotional state at a place connected with the deceased. So maybe your dear old beloved grandmother dies, and you go to the tomb one morning to leave some flowers there. It's a sunny day, the sun in the trees. It's a very beautiful experience, the bird song and everything. And you have a little vision of Granny sitting on the grave, nodding and smiling happily at you. And then perhaps 3 or 4 days later, your sister has the same experience. Classic hallucination on their own at the tomb, emotionally charged state. This does not describe the resurrection appearances. They are far too diverse for that. Which leads to a problem, of course. If you deny the resurrection appearances, if you simply try and say they never happened, the early church made them up, then you're left with this amazing mystery of what explains the transformation of the disciples. What turns the followers of Jesus from a group of men and women hiding out in fear of their lives after Jesus' arrest and crucifixion, afraid the same fate will happen to them? What turns them into this incredibly confident missionary society prepared to turn the Roman world upside down? In fact, to hear that put in a more articulate form than I just managed there, listen to Pinchas Lapide, who is a Jewish scholar, not a Christian scholar. He's a Jewish historian, and he makes this observation. He says, if the disciples were totally disappointed and on the verge of desperate flight because of the very real reason of the crucifixion, it took another very real reason in order to transform them from a bunch of disheartened and dejected Jews into the most self-confident missionary society in world history. And it's interesting, Pinchas Lapide is very confident something happened. If you pushed him further, he'd say, I can't tell you what happened, but he's absolutely confident they saw something. And then, of course, it's also worth noting that the resurrection appearances come to an end. In Acts chapter 1, verse 3, Luke tells us that the appearances continued for about 40 days until Jesus ascended into heaven, and then short of one appearance to Paul in Acts 9, they stop. Which raises the question, of course, if these were inventions or stories or hallucinations or mystical experiences, why don't they carry on long into the early church? But we don't find that happening. We don't find people having these experiences of the resurrected Jesus after that time period. So that's 3 facts down. 2 to go. We've looked at the death of Jesus. We've looked at the empty tomb. We've looked at the resurrection appearances. Fact 4, our penultimate fact this afternoon, is that doubters and skeptics were converted. 2 in particular are interesting, actually. 2 in particular are interesting. James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul. Let's start with James. Not many people are aware that Jesus had brothers. Those of us who read our Bibles well know that, but I meet many people who don't actually realize that he had brothers, and we know the names of some of them. The Gospels mention some of them. We know of at least 4 by name in the Gospels: James, Judas, Joseph, and Simon. And the Jewish historian Josephus actually tells us about James, which is interesting. So you don't just need to read the Bible. You can read Josephus, the Jewish historian. Now, it does appear pretty clear that James was not a follower of Jesus during his lifetime. In fact, the Gospels tell us that none of his brothers believed in him. And actually, if you read the Gospels carefully, the sort of subtext is they believed he was a bit bonkers, actually. Older brother is going around claiming to be the Messiah. His brothers turn up on numerous occasions we're told to take him back home again. Deeply embarrassing, actually, for a Jewish leader to not have your own family believe in you. And so most historians would say those hints in the Gospels that his brothers were skeptical probably were dealing with historical reliability. You don't need to believe in the Bible as a Christian. You can just take it as a historical document. Go, right, okay, we've got, the brothers of Jesus were skeptics. So what happened next in the little potted biography we have in the New Testament of James? What happened next? Well, in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7, we read that one of the people that the risen Jesus appeared to was James. I would love to be a fly on the wall at that encounter, wouldn't you? To go, you've doubted your brother, you think he's a bit bonkers, he's been killed by the Romans for outlandish claims, you think, gosh, at last it's all over, now we can deal with the embarrassment of the family and put things back together again, and bang, the guy's rising from the dead 3 days. I'd love to be a fly on the wall at which he figured out his brother actually was the resurrected Son of God. Had a powerful transformative effect on James, as well it might, your own brother rising from the dead. He doesn't just merely convert, but he goes on to become a leader in the Jerusalem church, and a very important figure in early Christianity. And more than that, more than just a leader in the early church, he ends up dying for his beliefs, according to the first century Jewish historian Josephus. That is quite a turnaround. In fact, a friend of mine was talking to one of the leading kind of atheist skeptics writing on the Bible today, a gentleman called Bart Ehrman, who has written many, many skeptical books about Christianity. And over that conversation, Bart actually admitted, he said the conversion of James, the brother of Jesus, still keeps me awake at night when I stop and think about it, because you would know who your own brother was. And the fact that his own brother, that James, went from skeptic to believer, causes at least one leading atheist sleepless nights, which I find encouraging. But another conversion, of course, it's hard to explain, is the Apostle Paul, who, as you know, we first encounter as a persecutor of the early church, doing its best to stamp out early Christianity. And of course, Paul turns dramatically from persecutor to preacher when he encountered the risen Jesus. And then Paul ends up willing to face arrest, torture, and execution for his belief in the risen Jesus. And as one historian remarked, liars make bad martyrs. At the point where your life depends on it, that's the point at which most people go, okay, yeah, it was a lovely story for a while, but actually, no, that didn't happen. But none of this generation of witnesses do that, and many of them die quite horrible deaths as the early church was persecuted. So 4 facts down and 1 to go. We've looked at the death of Jesus. We've looked at the empty tomb. We have looked at the resurrection appearances. We've talked about the conversion of skeptics. Last fact that I want to leave you with this afternoon is that the early church was founded on a belief in the resurrection. Something needs to explain how the early church began. Most of the first Christians were Jewish. They had a perfectly good religion that had served them well for over 1,000 years. And yet something caused the first Christians, the first Jewish followers of Jesus, to break away from Judaism, to proclaim that Jesus was not just the Messiah, but was God's Son, the world's true King, crucified and risen from the dead. Interestingly, actually, many Jews, as an aside, believed in the resurrection, but they believed the resurrection is what happened to righteous people at the end of history. There would be a resurrection at the end of time when God brought history to an end. And that's what the first Christians should have believed. You'd have expected them to believe. You'd have expected them, if they behaved like other Jews of the time, to go, well, okay, our beloved leader has been killed, so, we'll take his bones, we'll put them in a jar, we'll preserve his remains, and then we look forward to the fact that he will rise on the last day. We don't know of any other Jewish group getting it into their heads that actually the resurrection was something that happened to their leader in the middle of history. But that was the belief that turned the early church upside down. It caused them to change the world forever. It caused them to lay down their lives. It caused them to start a movement that would change the world. So those are the 5 facts that we have to explain. We have to explain the fact that Jesus was crucified, that his tomb was found empty, that there were resurrection appearances, skeptics were converted, the fact the early church founded on the resurrection. And all of them have amazingly good historical support. How do we explain them? Of course, if you're a skeptic here, or not here this afternoon, but if you are a skeptic, life does get tough at this point. In fact, one of the Christian world's most famous philosophers, a gentleman called William Lane Craig, you may have heard of William, a very famous Christian philosopher. I remember him once telling me the story of debating a skeptic at an American university who'd written a PhD on the resurrection. And this skeptic was unable to deny any of these 5 facts. He couldn't knock any of these down. So his theory to explain them was that Jesus had an identical twin brother from whom Jesus was separated at birth. This mysterious twin hid himself away for 33 years until the crucifixion, at which point he snuck into the tomb, removed the body, and then appeared and pretended to be Jesus. And he presented on this in this debate. And apparently in the response section, Bill William looked at him and went, but you do realize this mysterious twin would himself one eventually die. And then there would still be a body that would still need to be accounted for. Where's that body? To which he said the skeptic went, body, hang on, wait. And the whole sort of thing unraveled gently in front of the audience that night. We laugh at that, but it sort of shows you, I think, just what an uphill struggle you have to do if you're going to try and explain any of this away. But all that said, at the end of the day, history can't prove 100% the resurrection happened. We can't prove anything happened in history, actually, but we can do what historians do all the time. We can look at the facts on the table. We can then think, okay, what best explains the facts in front of us? And we can ask, what of those theories to explain the facts that we have in front of us, what has the greatest explanatory power? And I overwhelmingly believe that the bodily, physical resurrection of Jesus from the grave has by far the greatest explanatory power. But of course, more than that, of course, if Jesus rose from the dead, that means his claims about himself are true. Of course, that really matters. I always want to say to skeptics, it's not some random fact of history, but everything changes. It makes a real difference to our lives for a reason that we talked about in the previous talk, actually. You see, I always want to say when I'm speaking to skeptical and secular audiences that, look, no matter how exciting your life is now, one day you will experience suffering and death. There is simply no escape from that. But if Jesus rose from the dead, then his promises that those who follow him and put their trust in him will also share in his life after death, those promises can be trusted because they're proven, because people who rise from the dead have tremendous credibility. I turned 49 this year, a few months ago, so I'm getting close to middle age, and that means I'm certainly nearer to death than some of you in this room. I won't mention those of you who are older, but some of you in this room, I am definitely nearer to death than. In fact, I think David Galloway would probably say 1 or 2 more jokes, Andy. You might be nearer to death than you realize. But as I get older, and as I follow Jesus more, of course, the more I realize that the joy of being a Christian is that I can look forward. As we get older, we can look forward. Not to the process of aging and dying itself. That isn't a lot of fun. But I can look forward to being with Jesus in the new heavens and the new earth. And not because that's pie in the sky when I die and that somehow makes me feel psychologically better now, but because of the solid, concrete, evidence-based fact of Jesus' resurrection, which convinces me I am not kidding myself, that I'm not deluded, but my hope is based in something real. And I think we can challenge our secular friends, our atheist friends, our agnostic friends. We can ask them the question, what is your deepest hope in life? What is your deepest hope in life? And what is your evidence for that hope based upon? What are you standing on? Or are you just standing on thin air? See, my hope as a Christian is based on what Jesus himself said, where he said, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. What powerful words to end this part of the afternoon on. Well, thank you for listening. David is going to come and join me, and we're going to do half an hour or so of questions. And this is the point at which you can shape the entire content and the look for the next 25 minutes or so. And what should we do, David? Just open it up for hands. You've got an idea how you want to do this?
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do
that.
Let me just say one thing. And clearly, Andy has shouldered the heavy lifting on the speaking engagements this afternoon. And
I should have read the email more carefully, shouldn't I?
You should have done.
I definitely should have done.
So we're deeply, deeply grateful to him for that. And the other thing I would say, just as we approach the Q&A, it's only appropriate and proper that we maintain that balance in the questioning.
Oh, very good, very good.
No, let's take some discussion from the floor. So, well, anything on which you've had observations, comments, questions. It's unusual.